I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like, imixwhatilike.org, at I Mix What I Like for all your relevant social media. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. And of course, once again, back by popular demand is Dhoruba Bin Wahad, formerly of the Black Panther Party, Black Liberation Army, part of the New York 21, longtime political prisoner, longtime activist organizer, and back to talk with us again about a number of things centered on the topic of fascism in particular. And before we turn it over to you, Dhoruba, I wanted to sort of frame it in this way. First of all, I wanted to remind people that they can go to imixwhatilike.org and get the 2016 conversation that we had. There are several that they can get, but in particular, where after Trump was elected, you encouraged us to build a national front against fascism, rather than be cowed or feared, put in fear by his election. And just yesterday at the funeral for John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, longtime SNCC activist, civil rights leader, etc., former President Bill Clinton made the comment that the civil rights movement had almost gone too far to the left and to be taken over by Stokely, meaning Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, of course, but that John Lewis saved it. That the movement was then saved by people like John Lewis. And I thought of a lot of things when I heard him say that, but one of them was, of course, I thought of you and how if there was to be a comparison, you would certainly be a representative more of what Clinton feared as the quote unquote Stokely side of the movement, in part because of what I think Clinton and many people I think recognize Clinton and the Clintons to represent, a kind of corporatist dominant takeover of what was supposed to be the people's electoral political party or option, the Democratic Party, the first DNC candidate for that party. In other words, the symbolic fascistic takeover of democracy or the democratic apparatus. And I know that's something you wanted us to talk about today, the particular, now others like you and George Jackson and many others had talked about fascism, had already been here some decades ago, but it's being talked about a lot now in the context of Trump. Others have seen it in the context of Bill Clinton. You wanted us to talk about it also in the context of how Black Lives Matter is being conceptualized as the leading opponent to that force in the United States. So I say all that to say, to turn it over to you now, to ask you maybe to start with your response to what Clinton said of John Lewis, or then to maybe just talk about, as you started in an email to me the other day, the definition of power is the ability to define phenomena and have it act in a desired manner. And if the movement can be characterized by John Lewis and not Stokely and defined in that way and act in that way, we might see something more akin to Black Lives Matter than the Black Liberation Movement you talked about in our last conversation. So I'll stop there and turn it over to you and ask you to elaborate on or respond to anything I've just said. And thanks again.
Well, Jared, thanks for having me back again. But as usual, you're so complete in pulling things together. Actually, you said everything for me, so I don't say nothing.
All right. It's just hosting and editing all these conversations. Maybe I picked up a thing or two. I don't know, but go ahead.
But I just want to jump in on a part of that. I mean, there's a lot to fascism, and it's not just a simple term, as I tried to point out. And it has evolved. It has evolved with the idea and the notion of the corporate state. And the idea that the corporation is individual, the Friedman style of capitalism that places individuality without responsibility on corporations. And if we check in, if we had a psychiatric list, a list of psychosis and neurotic behavior, and we had a checklist, and we checked off the person, an individual who behaved like a corporation, and the corporations themselves, the corporations would be declared crazy. They would be declared antisocial, sociopaths, and everything. Okay, having said that, the Black Lives Matter and fascism. Now, we're in a historical moment here, Jared. And I think that, as I always tried to point out, that contrary to the popular belief that history repeats itself, I don't believe history repeats itself, but it does rhyme. And that does mean that conditions may never evolve the same way, especially after industrialization. We have to understand that human society, and especially Western society, went through a radical change with industrialization. And that affected every facet of working class people's lives, of native, indigenous peoples who had their land stolen. The whole struggle of chattel slavery versus wage slavery versus chattel slavery was an essential economic part, a locus for the Civil War. And of course, wage slavery won. It had to win. So bringing this up to date with Black Lives Matter, and the reason why I said Black liberation, the Black liberation move matters, and not Black lives, is because without power, Black lives, of course, don't matter. It's all relative. With power, however, Black lives have to matter. They have to be considered because power has to be considered. Okay, and right now, Black folks have been, as Amilcar Cabral aptly put it, and I'm paraphrasing, that Black liberation is a return of African people to their own historical continuum that was interrupted by the European historical continuum. I mean, when we go to European history, when we were growing up in school, we always saw that Black people, that the African experience was always a footnote. It was a footnote. And when we look at the U.S., the current U.S. Competition with China, if we go back in history to the turn of the century, we could remember when China was occupied by imperialist powers and they were pumping opium into the people and out into the world. And so now we look at this as a completely different thing. Now that the Chinese had decided about 15 to 20 years ago that they were going to lead the tech revolution, that they were going to transform Chinese society, and they did. And now they're head to head with the United States in terms of technology, in terms of geopolitical clout, and China is unrecognizable today as it was at the end of 1947. It's unrecognizable. And the reason why I say that is to say that the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to act as if it's occurring in a vacuum, as if it's just sprung up because someone kneeled in George Floyd's neck. And what that does is that it's because this is a historical moment, the kneeling of the symbolism of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, a clear victim of white supremacy and police racism, institutional racism, has galvanized the whole world is because of the crisis of capitalism, and it has put other peoples of color and other oppressed people in vis-a-vis their governments, vis-a-vis the national security state apparatus, which is the model that came out of the industrialization of the West. Now, so Black Lives Matter. If we really want to be honest, how did we wind up with that term? How did we wind up with a hashtag becoming the name of a movement? Because if Black Lives Matter, it started out as a hashtag after Trayvon Martin. After Trayvon Martin miscarriage of justice, and if we look at the players who were involved in that miscarriage, we see the same players that were involved in that miscarriage are also involved on the George Floyd team. The same players that were involved in the Trayvon Martin affair and the aftermath of that, the same
the Michael Ferguson, the Michael Brown in Ferguson apologies. Who is where I think you mean to be talking about, and by the way, who the cop was just said he wasn't going to be prosecuted. The former cop who killed Mike Brown wasn't going to be prosecuted. So it is kind of perfect to talk about no power in versus the symbol or the statement of Black Lives Matter.
Yes, I just wanted to point out that according to the founders themselves, they came to the forefront. They came out and voiced the outrage after the Trayvon Martin.
Right, my apologies. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go.
That's what I was referring to.
Right,
the Mike Brown case was in Ferguson was, however, the first time that these activists actually hijacked the movement. Mm. This is the first time that they actually were the ones to do the press conferences. They were the ones while the young folks in Ferguson were out in the streets demonstrating and throwing tear gas back and forth and burning down the different CVSs and protesting in the streets that brought the whole issue to national attention. It was the professionals, the professional, what do you call it? The foundation, the people that get all these grants and stuff, the
nonprofit leaders.
The nonprofits, yes. These individuals had expertise. They're very intelligent. They had expertise. They were outraged. I'm not going to say that they're outraged over the racist treatment of Mike Brown and what happened wasn't legitimate. I'm not saying that they went into that as illegitimate activists. I'm saying that they went in with a certain expertise and a certain experience and certain connections that was able, and they were able to amplify that with the media, with the white media. And it was the media, it was the white media that took the hashtag and began to label it Black Lives Matter. It was the media. And we have to understand, and reason why I quoted Huey about power being the ability to define phenomena is because once the parameters of the debate are set, then this is the left and this is the right, then anything that enters into that debate has to conform to the contradictions or the questions or the issues of that, or those within those parameters. And so when the enemy, when the opposition, when the system, the media, the corporate media sets the parameters of the debate, they automatically hamstring us, because our history, our needs as a people transcend these parameters. You know, I was just listening to NPR today. I mean, NPR done got sickening, and I was listening to NPR, and they were highlighting a contradiction, a beef between two neoconservatives who were raised in the rural white Midwest, and one of them said that the murder of Floyd, or George Floyd, was not racist because he heard that it was personal. That the officer and the cop and George Floyd had run-ins before, and so that he was actually exercising a personal vendetta on George Floyd. And we know, and you know, and everybody that understands and analyzes racism knows that white supremacy and racism is not a matter of personal ideology, of personal choice, or personal feelings. Racism and white supremacy is a system. It's a economic, it's a cultural, and it's a political system. And individuals may or may not agree with some of the propositions of it, but it's not about individual exercise of power. It's about the parameters of power exercised by the most powerful elite and entities in society. Okay, the same way they try to rectify or justify the Civil War and Confederate monuments as being indicative or symbolic of they tried to, make it look like it's symbolic of American culture. That it was just about the old boys fighting the good fight and losing and pulling their lives back together from the devastation of the Civil War. It had nothing to do with chattel slavery. It had nothing to do with wage slavery versus chattel slavery. It had nothing to do with where the U.S. was at economically at that point, where cotton and agriculture was at versus industrialization. All these things had nothing to do. It was just about old boys trying to exercise the culture of the South, which is total bullshit. Okay, and so when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we have to understand that it's occurring now in this place at this time. Okay, it has the 60s, the 50s, and the 40s, and the history of Black radicalism, but behind it, which is never mentioned. Okay, so we have to understand, what does Black Lives Matter really do? What does it really mean when anybody could spring up in any city, and rightfully so, take to the streets and put on a T-shirt, and then the press will come out and say it's the Black Lives Matter demonstration. And the individual, you would ask them, so you're a member of Black Lives Matter, so what's happening with this chapter? Oh, I just started out just now, and, we're not really a chapter, or we're not organized. Like everybody gets mysterious. So where's all the millions and billions of dollars go? Millions of dollars go? It's going to a hashtag? It's going to a movement that doesn't exist? We have to understand encapsulation. Encapsulation is the strategy that's employed by the powerful to destroy, to divert, and to dilute movements. Mm-hmm. It's a very simple strategy. If you have a revolutionary movement and people rise up and they come up with slogans like, say, when the Black Panther Party came up, Black Power to the People. Mm-hmm. They came up with a slogan that couldn't be co-opted. No one could say, the white supremacists couldn't say white power. In fact, when they did, it became clear where they stood, okay? The police couldn't say off the pig. The police couldn't, they had to define themselves as servants of the people. They were here to serve and protect. All of these statements, all of these things came out of the 60s, okay? Because encapsulation means that you take a movement, or you take an idea, or you take a people's struggle for freedom, and you encapsulate it with the type of leaders, with the type of issues, so that those people wanting to do something, those people who want to become part of this movement, join this organization thinking they're going to achieve these things, when in fact they've been dead-ended. They're not going to achieve any of these things, you see, because it's encapsulated. A good example of this before Ferguson was the new Black Panther Party. They were encapsulated organization. Their purpose was to take the history and the radical tradition of the original Black Panther Party and reinvent it with dogma from the Nation of Islam, with narrow nationalist ideology, and with infantile understanding of class, and put on Black berets, Black leather jackets, march around with guns, and people would say, oh, this is the Black Panther Party. And you have a whole generation that's grew up for the past 15 years that didn't know the original Black Panther Party ever existed. They didn't even know what the 10-point program was. All they knew was Zulu Shabazz and Hakim and these other Negroes that were fronting and running around with guns and boots, talking about white people were the devil. They were using the same old ideology, the messianic ideology of the Nation of Islam, the old messianic ideology of the Nation of Islam, because that's where they came from. But that wasn't the original new Black Panther Party. Came out of Texas. And it did not have that ideology. It was only when they took over that, these refugees, so to speak, from the Nation of Islam, when they took over that they were able to take the name of the Black Panthers, the imagery of the Black Panthers, and redefine it and reorganize it and refocus it so that it became meaningless. It became just posturing. It became rhetoric. It became, the ideology became narrow nationalism that could be easily refuted by facts. And if you notice, they had no history. They had no attachment to any radical movements from the past. In fact, they condemned all of the radical movements of the past as being inadequate, bogus, and fake. So now we ask ourselves, where's the new Black Panther Party today? It doesn't exist. You haven't seen it on the streets. You haven't seen it in Seattle. You haven't seen it in Portland. You haven't seen it in any of these areas where the people have took them to the streets in righteous outrage against the injustice of systemic racism. It doesn't exist. That was the purpose of it for 15 years, to make sure that when people took to the streets this time, they did not have the historical and the radical tradition of the Black Panther Party to actually draw on and develop from that point forward. Now we have Black Lives Matter is encapsulating the idea and the notion of the Black liberation movement. So Bill Clinton is absolutely right. If we look at the history of the merger between the Black Panther Party and SNCC, how it broke up, it's in the COINTEL profiles. But when was the last time we heard anybody from the Black Lives Matter movement talk about COINTELPRO? Talk about and refer to the actual files. Because in the actual files are the actual facts. If we want to look at the United Front Against Fascism and the original one, I had to go to the FBI files in order to find the document. It doesn't exist outside of the FBI. Why? Because the enemy has institutional memory. The state has institutional memory. It's the activists that don't have an attachment to the historical memory. So we reinvent failure. So Black Lives Matter is headed towards encapsulation. It's encapsulating all of this rage, all of this momentum, and it's leading it nowhere. It's talking about, in certain areas, divestment. And what does divestment mean? Divestment of the police department. What will that change? It's talking about defund. What will defunding the police change? What would it actually change? If a police department had a $6 billion budget every year, and you diverted $1 billion to healthcare and for children's daycare centers, they still got $5 billion, and they still got the union, and they still got the same edifice and the same institutions.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, because from our last conversation, your reference and emphasis of on the police unions, I think, is of particular interest. That's not a point I'm hearing anywhere else. To this other part of your question or point, this is part of my concern about the call for a decentralized leadership or a leaderless movement, which I've never felt.
Never heard of.
I don't. That doesn't work, because if you listen to certain pockets within what is labeled Black Lives Matter, there are people who attach very specific demands to explain defund the police that go beyond, say, 1/5 of the budget, and they talk about, disarming and replacing people with social workers as opposed to armed police showing up.
They're reimagining the police.
So there are efforts. What I think, to your point, as I understand it at least, is that what is missing at this point is a nationally organized platform that is specific and consistent, that isn't co-opted and for instance, and rebranded in some instances as defund the police and fund private security forces developed by the Koch brothers. Like
I mean, yeah,
anyway,
because the opposition has to get ahead of the movement. And to get ahead of it, it has to define the parameter. It has to define what the goals are to get ahead of it. And one of the things that we've learned from revolutionary struggles historically is that we have to define our relationship to the status we have to make a distinction between ourselves and what we oppose. We have to make a clear line of distinction so that the people will understand what we advocate and what we stand for, as opposed to what the enemy is advocating and what they stand for. Now, when you blur those lines with superfluous slogans, hands up, don't shoot, I mean, that's an emotional response to somebody that was murdered with their hands up. Okay, I can understand the emotions behind, but you don't make that into a movement slogan, because that's the universal sign of surrender. Hands up. Don't shoot, and you get shot anyway. Okay, that's what they call a war crime. Okay, and so we need to understand that this
talking about Asada too, by the way. Going back to our last conversation, your hands up and you get shot anyway, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, now that you mentioned it, a segue is because you have no consciousness and no connection to your actual movement, the history of it. You don't even know there's political prisoners that's in jail right now fighting for, that spent all of their lives in jail for exactly what you out in the street fighting for. You don't even know they exist, so you could have a T-shirt that says Asada taught me and not know that Sundiata, her comrade, has been in prison since Asada escaped. He's in jail. So what is it? Asada taught me, Sundiata I forgot is on the back. Okay, so Asada
or and underneath that and say Ku just got out.
yeah. I mean, it's things like this that we understand that the leadership. The leadership of a movement that doesn't understand their connection to their own history is a bogus leadership. It's a bogus leadership in the sense that if it does not attach itself to the people's struggle for liberation and for freedom, what is it representing? It's representing reform. It's representing a way to to make white supremacy more palpable to us? What is it? I mean, what are they actually fighting for? Because if we're talking about something as simple as controlling the police, it's very simple. I mean, this is not nothing that's rocket science. We know how the police evolved in the United States. We know how they evolved from the days of slavery to the urbanizations of certain centers and during the industrial age. We know about the gangs in New York being organized by that cracker. What's his name? The mayor who first began to organize the gangs in New York.
About like Tammany and all of that.
Yeah, well, yeah. What was his name?
Way back when, or like
Boss Tweed,
right?
And all of these guys in Chicago and all. This is why the police departments in Chicago, in New York, in Boston, and in Philadelphia were predominantly Irish. There was a reason for that. We got to go into history and see why was that. Don't act like black folks wasn't around when they was forming the police department. They came out of street gangs in the urban areas. So now we got street gangs banging in the black community. And what are we talking about? We don't talk about making them responsible in our community and organizing them into a self-defense force for our community. No, we're talking about we got to call the cops on them because they're killing each other. And they're killing each other because you let the enemy define the parameters of the issue. Okay? Now, if we want to really talk about deconstructing the police, we have to understand why the police are necessary at this point in history to somebody like Trump or to the corporations of America. Why are they necessary now? And fascism is the context in which the necessity evolves, because fascism cannot exist without a national security state and without an authoritarian a form of government that has a national police force at its disposal. America has.
I'm sorry, Dhoruba, just real quick, because I touched on it, you touched on it a little bit, just so the folks that watch this are clear. How are you defining fascism? The word is used a lot right now. I sort of defined it as the corporate takeover of democracy earlier on in the conversation. But how exactly do you define fascism? How would you suggest we define it and understand it and going forward?
Well, we have this Frankenstein version of fascism here in America, because we have the merger of democracy, so-called democratic institutions, with the corporate state, with the corporate militarized state. Fascism has always been the marriage or the unity between finance capital and the rich and corporations and the state. Well, it's the state that has the monopoly on violence. It's the state that can legally kill people, literally. It's the state that could control dissent. So without a national force, without a national police force, fascism is almost impossible. And when we look at the history of fascism, its rise to power in Italy, its rise to power in Germany. I mean, there were differences. The brown shirts that Hitler had, he had to translate them into the police, and the way he did that was to weaken the regular gendarmes, the regular police, merge them into the fascists, and out of that came the national police force that Hitler needed, as well as the Gestapo, the political. They could roughly be compared to the FBI, because they were the ones that kicked people's doors in for whispering, anti-fascist statements and stuff like this. So we have to understand that fascism has always emerged from the right, and it always emerged as an instrument of the rich and the industrialists to control the economy and the military of a state. If we really look at fascism and how it arose in the 30s, almost all of the major U.S. corporations during Hitler's rise to power and even after he was in power supported Hitler. Ford supported Hitler. J.P. Morgan supported Hitler. IBM was the one that was used. IBM codes, and that were actually used for the extermination of Ashkenazi Jews. It was IBM, and now I believe the head of IBM might even be a Jew himself today. Okay, apologizing for IBM, saying, "Oh well, they just used IBM at the time. We wasn't really down with it." You see what I'm saying? So we need to understand Standard Chartered Bank, Barclays Bank. They all got rich off the chattel slave trade. Let's not get this shit twisted. Okay, whenever there's been a decline in human rights, whenever there's been a tragedy, finance capital has always made a profit from it. Always. Always. Out of the Holocaust, out of the murder of millions and millions of people in Europe, Black, Roma people, not just Jews, dissidents, mainly communists, socialists, okay? Out of this came what? Came the Marshall Plan, the reinvigoration of Europe to what we have today. Out of that Holocaust came the state of Israel, a European settler state, a Zionist state. Zionism went from an ideology of rich Jews in Europe to the ideology of a national security state in the middle of the Middle East. Okay, so we need to understand that encapsulation doesn't just mean taking over an organization and misdirecting it. Encapsulation means taking over a people's movement and their historical perception of themselves and redirecting it. This is why Bill Clinton could say that a bootlicker like John Lewis, you know, I mean, this guy died with so much shoe polish on his lips.
Oh,
Griffin, I mean, they have access. I mean, and we know the role that he played because of the way that white folks have celebrated him. I mean, that man's laid for the last 2 weeks. They have eulogized this individual who has done absolutely nothing for his own people. All he did was get hit in the head and beat up on a bridge named after a Ku Klux Klansman marching to vote. And people will tell us that our right to vote is what we're out in the streets fighting for. Why are we fighting for the right to vote? Black folks have never fought for the right to vote. They fought for the right to be empowered, and voting was a mechanism and a means towards that end. If we could have got empowered without voting, we would have did it. But we know from Tulsa that wasn't possible. You know, do we hear Black folks saying today taxation is tyranny? No. We hear one knucklehead in the Congressional Black Caucus saying that if you're not going to supply the Black community with A, B, C, and D in terms of health care, we're not going to pay taxes. Because taxation without representation is tyranny. White folks threw all of the tea that Britain had into Boston Harbor because they believe that you can't tax us if we can't represent ourselves. Well, why don't we have that attitude? We're getting taxed. We don't have housing. We don't have adequate health care. We don't have, and they tell us, sign up for the census, because that's going to determine the amount of resources that are going to come in your community. How's that going to determine anything when we have the Republican and the right gerrymandering our districts so our census numbers really don't add up to anything, okay? But they gerrymandered themselves into a corner. Because although they gerrymandered these districts to break up our ability to vote as, quote, Democrats or anti-conservatives or whatever you want to say, they also broke up the districts so that if we went to the electoral polls tomorrow and put a referendum for decentralization of police on the ballot in most of these cities where we are a majority, we will probably win that referendum. That means that we could control law enforcement in our community. Because in America, this is what I meant about the Frankenstein of fascism. It doesn't have a national police force. Trump realizes this. And this is why he sent marshals into Seattle, marshals into Portland, because he doesn't have a national police force to take the streets back the way he wants. An authoritarian figure cannot operate without a national police force. Of course, here we have the Frankenstein version of that. We have two political parties that act in that fashion for that purpose, but they don't even have a national police force. The policing in America is on the local level, state, county, and municipal. All police departments have local charters, okay? Which means we could change those charters, which means that those tax dollars that go to the PBA funds and go to racist policing could also come to us if we control the police. Now, and we go into cities with mayors and a city manager, a type of structure, It's the mayor and the city manager that appoints the police chief. They're a political appointee. And of course, he's susceptible to the political pressure of the unions. So you never have a black politician, black or white, who stands up and doesn't try to make like he's pro-law enforcement in order to get the union's endorsement. Why would he want the union's endorsement when the union doesn't represent working class people? The police unions are not working class unions. They are the unions of the armed agents of the state. There is no worker in America that has the right to shoot you and kill you as part of his job. Not one, but the cops. Now, because they have this unique relationship to the state, they are armed agents of the state. They will do what the state tells them to do. And we saw that in Portland. Recently, the police the feds went buck wild, and the local police was like, yo, this is guarding the federal building? They had to come up with a pretense for sending them there. Guarding federal buildings. These buildings have to be guarded, and these are federal agents so they can guard the building. After 9/11, the enemy, the opposition, the corporate rich tried to establish a national police force with Homeland Security. That didn't work. Okay? And if we look how these federal agents are being used, they're being used to quash dissent. They're not there to guard property, but if they were there to guard property, that just verifies what we said, that law enforcement's job is to protect the rich, to guard property rights over human rights, and to enforce the status quo.
Well, I thought that's what they were doing. That there was one and the same. That the crushing of dissent was the protection of property, or to protect property they had to.
But who owns? But if it's a federal building, who owns the property? Mm-hmm. Taxation without representation. Who that building belong to? Belong to me? If it belonged to me, I could burn it down. If it don't belong to me and it belong to you, then burning it down is a crime. I mean, this ain't no rocket science. If those property rights are more, I mean, look at what the so-called Republicans and conservatives, and I want to say that conservatism in America is a euphemism for white supremacy, for right-wing racist views. That's what it's a cover for. And you have the alt-right now. You get the so-called alt-right. They're supposed to be distinct from the extreme right. Okay, crackers got all these differentiations of why they crackers. Okay, but we can't have no differentiation of why we militant and why we not. Okay, so if we're talking about real deal, if we're talking about the black community controlling public safety, now we got to look at public safety as something more than the police. It's not just the police. It's healthcare. It's sanitation. It's education. It's all these different aspects go to make up the public health of the community. Public safety is a concern of all people in the community. Okay, so if we don't control public safety, who does? And who determines what's safe for us and what's not safe for us if we don't? So when we talk about defunding the police, we're not talking about taking a bit of funds that's allocated through the present system to the police. No, we're rethinking law enforcement completely, where property rights don't supersede human rights, where the police are not occupiers in our community. In fact, the police live in our community. That's the proposition that you're talking about. Now, of course, when you go in the police department, you're on probation for 36 months or whatever time, you're on a probationary period. We're saying that probationary period should be spent in the community that you come from. Why is it that the police have been quiet about white supremacy and systemic racism in the police department, only filing occasional suits when they feel discriminated against? Why is it that black cops always in the police establishment always form their own union? If the union really represented all the police, why is there a need for a black union? As in for a Puerto Rican union? Because the police unions do not represent the interests of even the police that's working there. They represent the interests of the corporations and the status quo that they invest all of that money in. Where does the police union money go? Who do they invest it in? What stocks do they put it in? Why is the issue of gun safety such an issue? Because the law enforcement establishment and the military establishment are like this. They're like one. And the arms industry, America is the number one purveyor of arms on the planet. The number one. And who trains most of the police departments on the planet? Americans. And who are their major crime partners? Israelis. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's clear. All the techniques that the police are using today, right there in the streets in Milwaukee.
Or
right
the fascist leadership that gets imposed throughout the Americas.
Absolutely.
Historically.
Yes, the whole history, right. The whole history of the unions in the Americas organizing and training fascists and death squads in South America for decades. I mean, you even had one program on NPR that talked about the overthrow of Pinochet. The overthrow of Pinochet in South America was actually a good thing and not a bad thing, because Pinochet was creating the type of environment that wasn't friendly to corporations. It wasn't friendly to trade in the Western Hemisphere. So he had to be done away with. Okay, but Kissinger got a Peace Prize.
Wait, not Pinochet. The one he
he replaced.
This is terrible.
But yeah, well, we get this Alzheimer's movement every now and then. That's what happens.
Oh my goodness, I gotta look it up real quick.
Well, we know what we're talking about.
Yeah, anyway, but keep going. It's
so what I'm trying to say is that fascism is the control of the national security state by finance capital. Mm-hmm. That's the essence of it. And it cannot operate, it cannot manifest itself without the type of political control of the masses of people that only an authoritarian figure can give them, or delusional a system of democracy. And this is where we differ at this particular historical moment. Fascism has always eliminated any type of democratic expression, historically. Okay, the fascism of Italy grew out of the workers' movement. The Fascista Party grew out of the workers' movement in Italy, and the rest is history. The Nazis rose to power, and Hitler came to power in '33 with the pretext of a communist and socialist takeover and anarchy when they burned the Reichstag down, and they blamed it on an autistic person, hung him, and Hindenburg then gave Hitler the right to rule by decree. Okay, so fascism has always come out of the right and has always squashed democratic and socialist movements. Here today, though, because we don't really have a democratic system here, we have an electoral college system, which does not reflect direct democracy. It's not like a parliamentary system. Here, winner takes all. Okay, the parliamentary system, you have a shadow government or whatever, whoever got the most amount of votes in the minority, they could form a shadow government. They could be critical of the individuals in power, although I have my beefs about the limitations of that being really democratic. Nonetheless, it's much more direct. One person, one vote is much more in play in a parliamentary system than it is in the electoral college system here in America. Having said that, we've had 2 or 3 presidents in your and my lifetime who won the electoral college and lost a majority vote. Okay, and each one of them presidents turned out to be pieces of shit, real right-wing pieces of shit. Okay, and so we need to understand that we don't have a truly democratic system. But now, when you impose the new religion of corporate finance capital, and that's the new theology of the West, capital. And the emphasis that we see, big, huge office buildings, and that says Finch and so, and they're like cathedrals,
right?
And so what we're dealing with here is a little different. We're dealing with democracy still exists on paper, electoral system, but fascism is in full effect. What is that? It's democratic fascism. And how is it democratic? Because it has the bogus pretense of being a democracy with the electoral college system, when in fact it's a dictatorship of property. How did the electoral college system come into existence? It came into existence because the former slaveholders, the landed gentry, those who had property, wanted to ensure, after they passed the so-called, what was it, the Declaration of Independence, which stated that all men were created equal. They said, well, man, if we all created equal, they might take our property. I mean, if we all created equal down the line, my kid might not, he might not keep these slaves in. What we gonna do about that? I tell you what we do. We'll make the vote based on the population in each particular area, and we'll count the niggers as 3/5 of a human being, so every slave master could have a vote. We put 2 3/5 together, we got 6/5. So we got an extra vote plus a fifth. You see, don't get it twisted now. That shit worked. It's been working.
It still works now, where prison populations count towards electoral strength. The communities where the prisons.
Yes, because the census doesn't say that you're in prison in upstate New York. It just says that you live in upstate New York.
That's right.
And the people in Harlem don't claim that brother that's inadequate as being in their household.
And you can't. And by the way, it was Salvador Allende that was thrown out in the U.S. supported.
Pinochet was the one that
Pinochet, and Kissinger helped put that together, and he gets the Peace Prize
along with Lee Docteau.
Right. And Allende gets a bullet in his head, and Pinochet
and they keep it moving.
A long career. Right.
Yeah, and he keeps it moving. And then when they finally come back to him, he's too sick to go to jail.
Right, that's right.
These crackers are so they done been in power so long, they're so feeble, and you should just shoot these crackers in the head when you get them. Say, look, ain't no sense in going through all this. Just save this money. Just put 2 in his bow tie and put them in the ground. But you see, people ain't that. People are trying to be more humane than the oppressor. Oh, he needs a fair trial, or he's innocent to be proven guilty, and all of that. Okay. Where did you get all this stuff?
I mean, well, that's still used, for instance, as a reason why we shouldn't support the Castro-led revolution in Cuba, because of the so-called firing squads and the death sentences, and of course.
But I don't know if Fidel ever set up any of these capitalists before the fire squad that didn't deserve a bullet anyway, and even so, if we were to come to power tomorrow, I would hope. If we were to come tomorrow, the first people that we're going to shoot is the reactionaries that created these laws that kept us suppressed. And then we have our own lawyers who write new laws to keep them oppressed. How you want to...
But a lot of people that would want to support you, Dhoruba, would probably say, why can't we just put them on trial and show our better humanity?
Because it never works. It never worked. When Obama came to office, we knew that the whole Bush regime lied to the American people. Along with Colin Powell, he was up there shaking valves and stuff. Lied to the American people, led them into a war that they're still in. Okay, they still got U.S. troops there, refusing to leave. Talk about we leave, we ain't leaving. How you gonna go in somebody's country talk about you came to rescue them, and then you find out they didn't want to be rescued by you? You ain't leaving anyway. Okay. I mean, this is how arrogant these people have become. How has the U.S. got 1,000 bases around the world, and every time somebody spits at an American soldier, their interest is being threatened in that area? If you didn't have a base there, your interest wouldn't be. You would know. We would even know that soldier got spit on.
But that's the point, though. They're doing that to spread democracy and the rule of law. So that when something like that happens, there will be a trial, and there won't be firing squads.
But that's not whatever happened. Whatever the U.S. has supported a regime that overthrew another regime supposedly for democracy was always a dictatorship. I mean, what happened to the Arab Spring? How did the Muslim who was elected duly by the masses of people wind up dying in prison, and the new ruler is a military dictator? And the U.S., and he's number 4, I think number 3 or 4 in the U.S. Supply chain for arms. Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is good to go with him. Look at Libya. Excuse me. Look at Libya. Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown by who? A black man. Okay, and the rest of the AU sat there and watched it. Didn't do nothing, okay? Didn't do nothing because they feared what the U.S. would do. They might not get this amount of money. And so when you look at each one of these regimes that sat there and did nothing, each one of these regimes today, as we look at whether they're in Liberia, whether they're in the Congo, whether they're in Rwanda, wherever they are, the ones that sat still in the AU are the same ones today that are crying now about how they don't have the type of healthcare system to deal with the COVID virus. You know, they need this and they need that. Okay, so we need to understand here that fascism has been in effect in the Western democracies for a long time. What has happened is that the extreme right now is the mainstream right. I mean, some of the things that Trump say today, you know, he's the only one that got away with this. Who would have got away with that? What would Eisenhower have gotten? I mean, look how they castigated Eisenhower for just talking about the military-industrial complex after he left. If anybody knew the truth about that, it was Ike. He was a product of the military-industrial complex. He was the political general that supervised the U.S. Campaign in Europe and the destruction of Nazi Germany. He was the man. And remember, the other one on the other side in the Pacific was Douglas MacArthur, who they claimed wanted to be a Julius Caesar and was talking about invading China. You see, at the end of the war, in order to get we just clean it all up and just run through this. And now he didn't know he was up against somebody that was far more historical and far more astute. He was up against Mao Zedong, and Mao didn't play that shit. You understand? He said, before you hit me, we crossed the Yalu and we will run your ass all the way back down the Seoul. And that's where they've been ever since. The war's still going on, technically. Okay, the U.S. went into Vietnam. Why? Because Ho Chi Minh was on the verge, through democratic processes, of taking over the whole country. The people wanted to vote for their Uncle Ho. So the U.S. had to come in with some pimp that they pulled out of Hawaii somewhere, put him on a plane, just like they did that other knucklehead that they took into Korea. What was his name?
I don't remember his name either, but
I remember.
But in both Korea and Vietnam, they assassinated the leaders and installed new ones, divided the countries, and created these permanent wars.
Permanent wars, but Vietnam won. Mm-hmm. Korea is still divided, and the U.S. is still occupied. They had to run the military out of South Vietnam in order to unite their country. Korea is never going to get united unless they run the Americans out their country. That's clear. But the U.S. over these 50 or 70 years have created a comprador class that has an interest in the South Korean state maintaining itself. It's the same way with the decolonization of Hong Kong and China and Formosa, what used to be Formosa, Taiwan. These are all provinces of China. So now how does the U.S. tell the Chinese that's like the Chinese telling the Americans, you know, you can't do this in the Bronx. You understand? Because the Bronx declared themselves independent of the rest of New York, you understand, and they're establishing relationships with China. You understand? You violating the human rights of the people in the Bronx. And then the Americans tell them, look, the Bronx is...
But that connection, I want you to make that more plain, because I can imagine, I'm thinking in terms of, for instance, you know, maybe a student of mine in a class or somebody maybe less familiar with this history or some of these newer activists in Black Lives Matter who might watch this and ask, well, what the hell does this discussion of China and the breakup of Vietnam and Korea have to do with Black Lives Matter and what we're trying to get done here? How are you seeing these connections?
This again shows you the bogusness of a hashtag movement. Okay, the hashtag movement is an emotional response to a generation that sees these blatant acts of racism and white supremacy and murder, and they try to stand against it. But they don't stand against it based on their history and their radical tradition. They're standing on it alone. And so they don't have no comprehension that the Black liberation movement in the 60s had concrete relationship between the people in Palestine, the people in the Congo, with Kwame Nkrumah. I mean, Kwame Nkrumah is a black star in the middle of the Ghanaian flag because Kwame Nkrumah slept in Harlem. He went to school, historically black university, and he was schooled by black nationalists and Garveyites.
That's true.
So where does black matter?
In the Harlem History Club and the Edward Blyden Society, for instance.
Absolutely.
That's right.
And then when we read the FBI documents, which I have, you'll see the FBI is talking about Ruby D.
Mm-hmm.
Reading a poem by Langston Hughes at a Black Panther rally. And you know what the reporter says? That a woman named Ruby D read a poem by some man named Langston Hughes, some black man named Langston Hughes. He don't even know the iconic relationship of Langston Hughes to black people, or that what Ruby D, her and her husband represented. He's clueless. This is an FBI bureaucrat writing about what he saw when he went to these black folks' meeting. They were reading poems by some guy named Langston Hughes. He ain't got no historical reference because the people have a history that he doesn't know about, okay? And this is where the Black Lives Matter makes that mistake, because we always had solidarity with oppressed people, always, okay?
Now, Black Lives Matter, but again, there are many who operate under that banner who will tell you, Dhoruba, that they do have solidarity with Palestine, that they've gone. They don't have solidarity
Palestine with them as a movement. We didn't have solidarity with them just as the Black Panther Party. We had solidarity with them as a movement. We were part of a movement. There was and look at it too. When we called the first National United Front in 1969, when we first called it, it was called this month in '69 in July. When we first called it, we had Youth Against War and Fascism, which was a white organization. We had the Students for Democratic Society and the West Underground, they were white. We also had so-called Yippies, which was the political hippies, they were white. We also had the Peace and Freedom Party, they were white. We also had the Rainbow Coalition, okay, the Patriots, the Puerto Ricans, the Chicanos, all of these people representing all of these histories, the indigenous people, AIM, they all came together in Oakland. Over 2,500 people. Go look at the FBI files. They actually counted how many people were there. It's in the FBI file. Over 2,500 registered and came to formulate a united front against the forces that were pressing against them after the gains of the civil rights movement in 1969. You know, in 1969, what people don't understand is that the so-called civil rights movement was waning. That the war on poverty that the LBJ had instituted had created a whole class of poverty pimps, many of them sitting in the Congressional Black Caucus today. They created a whole class of poverty pimps. They raised up the whole slogan of black on black crime in order to deflect from the occupying army of police in the black community. There was a whole sea change of white liberalism in attempt to deflect and blunt the struggle for black power at that time. This is what Bill Clinton meant. Bill Clinton meant that by 1969, it became clear to the urban, especially to the urban North. You remember what happened to King when he first came up to the North and started preaching. You know, people throwing rocks at him because they had this misconception. And I had that misconception too at the time, and I ain't gonna lie. That when you let somebody beat you up, you was a punk. You know, and I realized, of course, much later, that Martin Luther King was far from being a coward.
That's right.
That his strategy, although noble, although humanitarian, his approach to power, he actually renounced it in the end. Okay, and said that it was capitalism that was at the core of this, and this is how King wound up in Memphis. You know, representing garbage workers, black garbage. We ain't talking about white garbage, man. We talking about black garbage. You can't get lower than black garbage, man.
It's also, by the way, I got to remind people that, and you talk about the intelligence documents. Not only was King talked so poorly about in those intelligence documents as a threat and a scoundrel and a fraud and whatnot, but that's how he was talked about in the mainstream press at the end of his life too. And the press turned on him. And as I point out, since he was again just evoked by Clinton, less than 90 days before King was assassinated, the Washington Post was castigating him in the pages of their newspaper as an enemy of the state and a threat to national security for hanging out with Stokely Carmichael and all those Leninists and pro self-defense or violent
absolutely.
elements.
But they did the same thing. They did the same thing to Paul Robeson.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So we need to understand, I mean, this is our history. So how is it that a movement comes along now and doesn't draw on that history and doesn't understand that when somebody like Al Sharpton talks about another march on Washington at the end of August, that he's talking about building a movement by victimhood. He's talking about a movement that's led by its victims.
But this is the part I'm struggling with, because when I'm in dialogue to the extent that I am, or when I'm paying attention to what's being said from elements of this thing called Black Lives Matter, many of the people involved are convinced that they are doing that work, that they are doing the broad-based movement connections that you're talking about.
But they are. But the corporate media doesn't frame it that way. Of course they are. We got black folks, we got young black people all over. They're struggling for homeless mothers, taking over houses. We got whole movements in California, in the South, that are vibrant movements, just like Jesse Gray's movement for decent housing in New York led to rent control. We got young people in the streets that have been fighting against police brutality and police murder in Chicago, man, since the last 25 years. Mm-hmm. You understand what I'm saying? We have people that are doing good work in the street, but they are mobilized, but they're not organized. And without a united front, we don't have effect. So they're able to isolate these little struggles. They're able to pick out the individuals in those struggles, go after them, and raise up another leadership, just like they did with the gangs. The gangs that came in the wake of the Black Panther Party, most of those gang leaders had politics. But they were the ones that they threw in jail so that the drug dealers and the straight up, so-called gangster crew could take power and redivert all of that energy into what we have today. We have brothers and sisters out there set tripping in the middle of a historical movement. They're out there shooting each other. And then when we look at this, we understand too, just like we did back in the 60s, there's a history to this. What did the police do in the 60s? They tried to co-opt and encapsulate the Black Panther Party. They infiltrated it. They had individuals go out and do criminal acts so they could see this is what the party was doing. And now how is it that crime has went down during the quarantine since January? Crime has been down nationally, but violent crimes and crimes of using guns has tripled. How's that possible? Because it's the police in the streets doing these shootings. Because if you notice, nobody's getting busted. You don't see nobody shooting up a party for 15 people and then they don't have a clue who did it. They say, oh, you was shot up. We believe it was done by this gang. Or we believe it was done by that gang. So Trump said, okay, we're going to send in troops to help find these and keep this down. That's all pretext. It's the police that's doing it. And if it ain't the police that's doing it, it's their phony cronies and snitches that they don't gave a license to. The same ones that they was getting the dope from, that was snitching on them, tell them who to bust so that they could stay in business. They're the same ones that's out there doing this. And we know from the experience of the BLA and the underground that the police has always went to the organized crime in order to try to defeat us. But because we grew up with a lot of these gangsters, they would tell us this. They would tell us that the police from Bossy, the Major K Squad, pulled them over, took them into the police station, or pulled them over and told them, say, look, if you don't give us these cop killers, you ain't gonna have no drugs out here. We're gonna bust every worker that you got. and you go into jail too. We want to know who these people are. So the first place they went was to the criminals. The first place they went was to the illegitimate capitalists and said, you ain't gonna do business if we don't get these cop killers. Okay? And that's exactly what the illegitimate capitalists did. They did everything they could to inform on us. But because there's an inherent hatred of the police, even by the criminal elements, they felt awkward snitching. Snitching was like a value, like a moral. So they would tell us, you know, hey man, these people, they hot out here, man. You know, they got all my workers, they just busting them. They want information. And I know you since we was in junior high school, bro. You know, I ain't gonna, but you know, I don't have control over everybody in the street now. They be snitching. They told us this. So what do we think, that they don't have an institutional memory? They don't remember that this used to work? This is exactly what they're doing now. This coincidence, the gun violence has went up, and the amounts of people that's been arrested for this gun violence has not correspondingly went up. It just gave the police the pretext. Okay, so when you call 911, we ain't gonna answer. Okay, and in fact, that scares the average old person sitting in the projects that don't have nobody. You see, they're scared. They can't go out. They can't go shopping. And so when somebody like Jamil Al-Amin moves into Atlanta and takes over the whole area and makes the streets safe for ordinary people, they put him in jail. Okay? And he's been in jail for what? Imam Jamil's been in jail 20-something years now?
20 years now, yeah.
Absolutely. And this is the Rap Brown. This is where you get the name for your music from. Rap Brown. And the reason why he got that, because he could talk and he could break stuff down. And every time he broke stuff down, people burned shit down. So they passed a whole act, a congressional act, interstate travel to incite riots. The Rap Brown law. Go look it up. It's named after a black man who's in jail right now, and the average person on the street right now who's getting pulled over by the police, who's getting harassed by the police, don't even know Rap Brown exists. Doesn't even know he's still alive.
So, okay. But again, this is part of the problem that and one of the reasons why, you know, what little good it does, I want to keep having these conversations, because so much of what, obviously it's intended or an unintended, either way it's the same outcome, effect of the COINTELPRO of the past, similar operations that you know they explicitly stated in the fifth tenet of the COINTELPRO against Black America was to make sure that young Black people were disconnected from these radical traditions. So it's not a coincidence, I think, that young people are so disconnected. But one of the problems that I see existing is that the so much of this conversation, to your point, the part of the encapsulation process as I'm seeing it is so much of the conversation around, and this is what precipitated our last conversation, that so much of the conversation around what we're supposed to do in response to this is the space is taken up by people who don't appreciate these politics or these histories, or don't agree ideologically with the position that you and others have taken. Yet they are the spokespeople, even the ones literally telling us of the histories of these people. Like a lot of the more prominent academics and pundits who talk about Kwame Ture or the Black Panthers, they don't agree with these politics. They don't agree with the associated ideas, but they're the more prominent. So I almost want to just say, you know, how do we get more young people to be connected with these histories and to understand them? What do you see as a viable method?
Well, I think one of the ways that I talked to a lot of young people in the past 2 weeks.
And I got to interrupt again, Dhoruba. I'm sorry. That's exactly the point. That was where I was going. Forgive this interruption, but just the other day I see T.I. go on Roland Martin's show and talk about his plan for reparations from Lloyd's of London and what his plan for getting Black America some payback from Lloyd's of London. And he mentioned that he was in dialogue with Killer Mike and with Robert Smith, the Black billionaire, and other business leaders. But I thought it interesting that he didn't mention that he had just come from a meeting with you, for instance.
Let me tell you something about that meeting. Okay, he references Killer Mike. When Killer Mike came to the meeting, Killer Mike basically was talking about how Atlanta was in a unique position to consolidate Black wealth and use it politically. That's basically was his thing. about a Black Wealth Network and all that. I know. But we need to understand. You understand what he's saying. What he's saying is a cop-out. What he's saying is he doesn't understand that he's on the stage of history right now. That what he's saying and what he's doing is going to be recorded. It's going to be put down, and it's going to be proven a failure. And his name is going to be attached to it. Okay? The same way with T.I. When T.I. sat down with us, T.I. asked quite clearly, what is fascism? And we tried to give him a little understanding of it, but the fact that he was sincere and asked meant that, I didn't really appreciate, what fascism is. So now we jump to that, from that, to him talking about Lloyd's of London and reparations. Now, me, I'm Pan-African. I'm a Pan-African internationalist, and of course, everybody knows where I stand on reparations. Come on, man. But I also understand that we are not in the historical moment where reparations is even something that we should put on the table vis-a-vis our empowerment right now. What we need is power. What we need is the power number, whatever number it was in the Black Panther Party program. I think it was number 6. We need the power, or we need the ability to define power for our community. We need power. Once we have power, then the discussion about reparations becomes something that can be maintained, that can be financed, that can be turned into boycotts, that could be turned into actions, that could be translated into something concrete that everybody could understand. But without power, it's rhetoric. Without power, it's saying to white folks, yeah, y'all owe us some money. When y'all gonna pay us? If y'all ain't gonna pay us, I ain't gonna stop demonstrating. We'll keep demonstrating, nigga, because we ain't paying your black ass. You see? And they don't understand that capitalism is confronted with the issue of reparations inherently. That's what it's all about. Reparations is only part and parcel of a redistribution of wealth globally. Now, how the hell you think the 40 million black folks is going to get reparations in America with no power, with only representatives like John Lewis and the Congressional Black Caucus? Let's just say they all agree to reparations. We should have it right now. What do you think the effect is that going to be? Nothing.
Look, my only point, look, in this moment, I wasn't, I'm happy to continue on, but I wasn't attempting to litigate.
I'm just saying.
But just to be clear, my point is that in this moment, that's the problem. One of the problems I'm seeing, like for instance, and I'm not trying to pick on T.I., but it just was such a perfectly timed hit that he didn't even acknowledge your comrades' involvement or the ideas that you all would have discussed. He didn't put that on the table for Roland Martin's black audience.
Because the only reason he sat down with us, with Sekou, Jamal, and myself, the only reason he really sat down with us was because he knows our history. You see? And if you notice in the letter, we didn't attack T.I.
No.
We didn't attack Killer Mike.
Nope.
We didn't attack none of these people. And the reason why we didn't is because we want to try to get black folks to understand that we're the only people that got entertainers and basketball and football players as our spokespeople. You don't see white people going to a white hockey player, asking them why do you think the U.S. involvement in this affair with China is wrong? Okay, or what do you think about the Chinese ping pong team? Making a statement about capitalism. You see, they don't do that. They have their elected officials, they have their spokespeople, their experts, and all these folks, and to speak about U.S. policy, to frame it in the terms of the U.S. 21st century, America, and democracy, and they frame it in all. We the only ones that got basketball players or football players trot it out on national television and ask these profound questions. And they're not the Harry Belafontes and the Muhammad Ali's of the past, who defer to the political leaders of the moment. They got behind them and backed them whenever they needed the demonstration. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Jim Brown, whatever their individual politics was, and they all had their individual limitations. Okay, nobody's perfect around here. Right. Nobody's saying that these guys were some type of saints. They weren't. They were imperfect like everybody else, but they had enough principle to understand that they were not the leaders of a movement. That they were in the position they were in.
This is the point I keep trying to get to, though, is that by the time, so you all have this conversation with T.I. and Killer Mike, but by the time T.I. and Killer Mike get in front of mass Black audiences, it becomes a different conversation. It becomes a conversation centered around Black billionaires and business and sitting on the board of Lloyd's of London and.
But that's because,
so I'm only saying that to say that so their audiences are willfully, even in this case, maybe inadvertently, disconnected from the traditions and the histories that you're trying to connect them to, which we desperately are in need of to advance these struggles beyond the symbolism and the hashtags and all of that. That's the only point I'm trying to try to.
I got that, but in your book, you debunk the myth of Black buying power. You debunk that, and you lay out how capitalism really works here and what that really represents in terms of so-called wealth. If we calculated our wealth this way, we'd be the 5th largest nation and all of that bullshit. Okay? You got to understand, I don't know how many people read Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Jonathan Livingston Seagull. This was the story of a seagull who loved the art of flight. Seagulls just fly, it's normal. But this seagull, he just loved to fly. And he would try all types of tricks. He would try to fly upside down. And one time he got into this Zen position. He went up higher than any other seagull went before him. And when he got up there, these 2 seagulls, like spirits, flew right next to him. And everything he did, they did. And he never seen these seagulls before. And then one of the seagulls said to him, Jonathan, you are trying to perfect the art of flight. You are trying to reach your highest possibility of who you are as a seagull. But just remember this, the bird that flies the highest sees the most. Now, bringing that back to somebody like T.I. T.I. now doesn't have to sling no yayo in the streets. T.I. now is the OG of a lot of young people who look up to him right now on the path to success in the industry, in the field of entertainment and music. Okay? He has mastered his craft and his position to his own, to his own benefit. And nobody's knocking that. Nobody's saying that, because I strongly believe there's a lot of young brothers, illegitimate capitalists, whether they're criminals or entertainers or whatever. If they were the head of major corporations, they'd be better CEOs than many of the corporation managers that you have today. They just have that skill set. That's how they are. They built that way. They just never had the chance. They just never had the opportunity or access to wealth. T.I. now understands access to wealth. He sees it. Killer Mike is circulating with people that's trying to co-opt him. He was behind Bernie Sanders. He was behind Bernie Sanders for all the right reasons, perhaps. Bernie Sanders was talking about universal health care, free public school education. Bernie Sanders was talking about shit that was really real in terms of this capitalist society and that could not be permitted. Okay? So we know what happened to him. But Killer Mike was a surrogate. So what happened to Killer Mike when he gets knocked out? Bernie Sanders supports Biden. Does Killer Mike support Biden? No. Killer Mike falls back on being Black and having access to people who have power. He's on the mayor's committee, to empowerment committee here in Atlanta. All of these Black folks who have come into wealth, whether they're T.I., whether they're Jay-Z or whatever. Jay-Z went behind Kaepernick and established a relationship with the NFL. So now entertainers can do the Super Bowl and not worry about being labeled sellouts. Because, hey, Jay-Z hooked us up. And we know Jay-Z ain't a sellout. Jay-Z is sitting up with Buffett and millionaires talking about how he got rich, how his first record hit, and he did this, that, and the other. The gull that flies the highest sees the most. These guys who have been exposed to wealth, they could see the possibilities that they couldn't see when they were slinging that yayo on the street. And they never thought that hip hop would get them that far. Biggie said that. We ain't never thought to take us that far. You see? We ain't never thought that. And now that they did, now they're envisioning, why don't we control shit? Why ain't we doing like the Lloyds in London? Why ain't we doing this? But they're all thinking like capitalists. They're not thinking like revolutionaries. They're not thinking like Pan-Africans. They're not thinking like they came from the oppressed people and we're talking about a redistribution of the wealth. Because if they did, they would have formed their own consortium. Why do you need Lloyds in London? Why do you need to go to the white press and tell them this is what we should be doing? This means this is what black folks should be doing that you know. But if you were serious and you combined, just say each one of y'all gave up $100,000 and there's 500 of y'all. That's a lot of money, okay? And we formed our own consortium. And then we went and bought a 40% interest in the Ashanti gold fields. Now we got gold in the ground instead of around our neck. Or we went into the Congo and we bought a consortium and we invested in it. You got, with the money that these people make, if they put it into a consortium and acted just like the robber barons did at the turn of the century, we'd be in a whole different situation. I wouldn't mind them at all being capitalists, because now they're looking out for their own interests, and their own interest means that the masses of black people have to have some wealth. And we want to employ them. Why don't we have a Pan-African Refugee and Relief Agency? The African Union, 54 nations, doesn't have a relief agency. Doesn't have an Pan-African Relief Agency. They got to depend on the Red Cross, the Red Crescent. They got to call Doctors Without Borders. They got to they don't have their own. They don't have it. So why don't we have a Pan-African Refugee and Relief Agency? Do we need the AU to form one? And when we say Pan-African, we mean all black folks, whether it's the homeless mama in Los Angeles or whether it's the sister that's run out of her village in the Congo by some armed mercenaries who's working for iPhones, to get a coltan for iPhones, okay? Smuggling that coltan into Uganda so it could be sold on the market so that we could have it in our cell phones. Mm-hmm. There's black kids right now in the Congo digging in the mud at 12 and 13 years old with a knucklehead standing over them with an AK-47, and what they're taking out the ground is going straight to the iPhone. It's going straight to these corporations. You see? So what is T.I. talking about here? If he's talking about something that's real, why don't we have a Pan-African Refugee and Relief Agency? Your money alone. If you listen, remember when Katrina happened? Mm-hmm. We had P. Diddy. We had all of these guys taking phone calls for Red Cross, right? Remember the telethons for money for Katrina? They volunteered time to come in and answer the phones. Do we have a telethon for African relief? No. Do we have a telethon for Black Lives Matter? No. Do we have black billionaires and millionaires coming together and say, look, let's pool our money. I'll kick in 500. You kick in 200. You kick in 50. And together we got $2.5 billion in capital that we can use in terms of microfinancing farmers and trading that farm goods to the African stores, African markets here in the US. Look at all the Asian markets you have now. You go to Asia, you got 4 Asian markets with almost damn near within walking distance of where I'm sitting right now. Asian markets. I ain't talking about little poop butt spots. I'm talking about huge markets that are importing foods and produce from where? The Middle East, South America, and Africa, and selling it here to the people who come from those regions. So if I want to get some good oxtails, if I want to get some good yams and stuff, I'm going to the Asian market because they got it. They got more cucumbers in the Asian market than I even knew existed. I didn't even know they had this many cucumbers on the planet. I only thought it was 2 types. There must be at least 50 in the Asian market. So my point is that the shit that T.I. and them is talking is game. Because they don't roll so high, they could see what wealth can do. And then rather than set it up on their own, they're going to say, well, they owe us money because they financed the slave trade. If crackers owe you money, when you was on the street, if somebody owed you money, you went and got your pistol, went up, rolled around there, knocked on the door, said, nigga, I want my money. So why don't you do that to white folks?
Well, it's funny you said that, because the first thing I was thinking of is that the part that I admittedly left out of my book, the part that gets left out of a lot of these arguments, is the initial basis for the power that gives Lloyd's of London its ability to do what it does, which starts, Absolutely. Of course, with military conquest, colonial conquest, military suppression of a population and the theft of their land. I mean, this is, and their resources. On top of that, then you can institute all the laws and regulations that allow you to set up these insurance scams and permanently, invest in the rewards.
IMF.
So when you use that example, that to me is the perfect microcosmic example of what is missing from this, or part of what is missing from this discussion of power, to go back to where we started, and how a lot of these efforts are ultimately, as you say, just game or talk or short or just going to.
Or do we wind up with Jay-Z having a personal relationship with the governor of New York and telling him, "Oh, look, man, I'll supply masks for the majority for prisoners in the state of New York." He ain't talking about creating a prison break for the state of New York, funding the National Conference of Black Lawyers to take down the Rockefeller program, to take down the sentencing. He ain't talking about that. He's talking about some other shit. Okay, I'm saying to you, if you came up in the street and you was gangster, why ain't you gangster with these crackers now? You talking some, we need to do, why don't you, listen, what's his name? All of these gangsters, like my boy Jazz, Hayden, and them gangsters in Harlem, they formed a council. These are street thugs. They formed a council so they wouldn't be shooting and killing each other, and they could regulate, whatever drugs they were slinging out there, so that they could maintain the profit. And that only fell apart when they began to turn on each other. Of course, the enemy had something to do with that, but that's when it fell apart. The idea is, if you can form a consortium to control the drugs in your Black community, why can't you form a consortium to empower Black people internationally and nationally? Why can't you do that?
Well, me, the issue is that, I'm sorry, go ahead, because
you can't do that, because you're not looking at them as your enemy.
No.
You're looking at them as potential collaborators, as in potential investors. You want them to give back to you what they stole. Now, if I had stolen your money on the streets in the South Bronx, you wouldn't be talking about you want your money. You would have came to take my ass out. If you couldn't find me, you find somebody that was close to me, kidnap them, and send them back in pieces to me. This is all this gangster shit you do on the street. But when it comes to white folks, you talk about how they got a moral obligation. White folks ain't gonna give you jack unless you stick a gun in their face and you take it. And you got to begin that by controlling the guns in your community. And the way you control the guns in your community is you take over the armed agents of the state in your community, and you make them take your tax money, and fund the police in your community so that they protect you, so that they protect your interests, so they protect your property. And you decertify the police department, the police unions. And you do that by taking them to their court and saying that these guys are outside of their certification. They're exerting political influence into the Black community, and we want that to stop.
So
I'm just saying that when the TI talks about what Lloyd's of London did, we know Standard Chartered got its initial nut off the slave trade. We know Barclays Bank got their money off the slave trade. We know that most of these insurance companies began with the slave trade. So we're gonna go to them now and say, look, man, because you redline housing and we can't get no housing here, and y'all continued all of this, and you started all this off when my great-great-great-grandmama was a slave. Okay, and I want my reparation. That's not how you do that when you gangster. What happened to all that gangster shit you've been talking about?
Well, even for me, as someone who is not a gangster, never was a gangster, to me, the political equivalent of what I hear you saying is to organize movements that address themselves to achieving political power.
Absolutely.
And that to me is the politically gangster move, as opposed to individual claims, arrangements with billionaire business people to get reparations like that. That's
come on, man.
So So, I think we do need to start moving towards a conclusion here for this part of the conversation. But I want to give you any concluding thoughts, anything you think you want to wrap up with. My wrap up has already been said. We need movements for political power with
but I mean, don't get it twisted.
Now, go ahead.
Don't get it twisted. When I'm using the analogy of the streets, because this is where these folks come from.
I hear you.
And this is the value system that they're supposed to espouse, that they say that they still even faithful to this day. This is in their music every day, how they pull their gat out and blow you away. And it's all that gangster shit when it comes to me and you. But when it comes to them crackers, they throw their Uzi when the police show, they throw their Uzi under the truck. Or where was all them gangsters when that cracker was kneeling in George Floyd's neck? Where was all them thugs that was out in the street talking, oh man, you need to let him go. Ain't nobody threw a brick at that cop. Ain't nobody even ran by and punched him in the back of the head and kept running. Now and then his mama will get up there and his family will get up there. It's not his mama, excuse me. I don't want to, his mother's dead. His family will get up, okay, pushed up there by Sharpton. You understand? His family's apolitical, ain't had a political thought all their lives. Now they're thrust into the maelstrom of a movement because their kin was murdered so violently, so brutally, so nakedly on television that everybody in the world said, man, that's how they kneel on my neck. Black lives do matter. Let's get out in the street. And they got out in the street. And what do you stand up there and say? Oh, George wouldn't have wanted violence. Hey, if George would have got somebody violence when that cracker was kneeling on his neck, he would have loved it. Could get him off my neck. Would somebody please get him off my neck? If somebody would threw the camera at him rather than photograph it, he might still be alive today. You see? So what we're talking about is we have been so programmed that we would watch our own murder and brutality on television, on camera, and not do nothing about it.
I'm sorry to interrupt again, but I want to highlight something you've said in the past about that particular issue of the family of murdered victims becoming spokespeople for that issue or the movement. And you've been very clear, and I know to some, even myself, it sounds harsh initially, but I think it's an important point. I just want to highlight where you have said that the role of the family of the murdered victim is not to be a spokesperson for the movement. It is to grieve and recover as a family. The movement's organizers are supposed to be the spokespeople for that victim in the community, which would lead to very different conversations at press conferences about that murder. And so that's what I hear you saying. I just wanted to highlight that.
Because a movement that's led by victims has never been successful. I mean, when you look at South Africa, when the students was murdered in Soweto, the ANC's ranks swelled. Where did the kids go? They left to get trained by the ANC. Okay? And those that remained, they fought to build up the infrastructure against apartheid. Okay? Everybody suffered at Soweto, the families of those children. But you didn't see the families of those, the mother or the daughter that was killed in Soweto getting up talking about, oh, what we need to sit down with the system and get the pass laws lifted. No. They had a movement to fight. That movement was inspired, was galvanized by the treatment of their children, by the murder of their children, by the ruthless apartheid regime. And that's what George Floyd was. He was an inspiration to a whole generation of people that said, I'm not going to be a victim no more. And we know from France Fanon that the minute that the victim decides that he's not going to be a victim no more, it's a whole different movement. He's no longer a victim. Now he's active in his own liberation. So we need to understand that, yeah, Emmett Till was a victim. I mean, I remember Emmett Till's open coffin on Jet magazine to this very day. I think I must have been 14. I forgot. I was it was 1955, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I think it was 55. So I couldn't have been.
You'd have been 11.
I would have been 11, 12, something like that. So, I ain't had no politics like this at all then. But that picture, I ain't never forgot that picture. And his mama opened that coffin for that precise reason. Don't forget what they did to my son. And that sparked a movement. She didn't lead it. She wasn't out there talking, but I don't want nobody else to get lynched. She didn't do none of that. But when the movement had a victory, they would be, let me bring out Miss Till. And everybody give her a round of applause because she was the mother of the movement. And she knew her place. She knew her place was to inspire people. Don't let my boy die for nothing. And that's what the movement did. That's exactly what we did. He wasn't going to die for nothing. But now what do we have? The complete opposite. We have the Sharptons, we have the opportunists now who know the game. Look at the lawyer that George Floyd has. They have the same lawyer that Trayvon Martin had, the same lawyer that Mike Brown had, and he ain't won a case yet. He ain't won one case. Now, nobody keeps getting a lawyer that don't win nothing. So how did he get there? He got there because it's game. Now, that's not that, I don't want to say that the lawyer is insincere in what he's doing. He just don't do it good. He's not come on, man. He's not a Lennox Hines. He's not even a Bill Kunstler. You understand? He's not even my lawyer or Robert Boyle. Or Liz Fink, a fat white Jewish woman will get in the court and fight them to a standstill in the court. And before we went in the court, she said, let's go out there and kick their ass. That was her job. That's what she did. She wasn't out in the streets with me hollering and screaming. She was in that courtroom. When I got caught and trapped off, and I ain't had nobody to represent me, she would get in there and she would fight for me. I ain't owe her a dime. She ain't asked me for nothing. Okay? And she always stood. She was the one that represented the Attica brothers. The Attica case was won because she kept that case alive for 15 years out of her own pocket. That's how the case was won and settled. And then when the case was settled, only the two leading defendants, plaintiffs, got any real money. But because there were so many in that D yard, I think there was like 50, 60 that were in the suit, they only got like $2,000 a piece. The settlement was bullshit, but it was the victory that she fought for. Okay, and it was because of those Attica brothers that she wound up representing me because I was in jail with them. And they told her, if you don't represent Dhoruba, you can't represent me. These were Attica brothers. These were brothers that got their politics in prison in the D-Yard and that was murdered and beat up in the D-Yard. They told a woman that would get me out of jail, you got to represent Dhoruba. Because while I was in jail with them, I was educating them. I was talking to them every day. Every day we was reading and talking. And they knew I was a political prisoner. They knew all of that. And they told the lawyer, I know you got the Attica committee and everything, but you got to help Dhoruba. That's what they said. This is legacy. This is passing on the struggle. We don't have no standing without struggle. So these kids that are fighting in the streets, they fighting the right fight. They're doing the right thing. They're motivated by the right thing, but they're not in touch with their own history. They're mobilized, but they're not organized. So they're gonna reinvent failure. So the Sharptons could come out and call for another march on Washington. We could have another 1 million man march, 1 million women's march, 1 million grandfathers march. We're going to keep marching. And the media, who's attached to the establishment, who's attached to the state, is going to keep defining our marches and defining our goals for us. Okay? And meanwhile,
you already said it. Sharpton's bringing us back to a march that to commemorate King, as he claims, where King himself had said, "This is not effective. This isn't this is not what we're
absolutely
not the move anymore."
And he's possibly leading his people into a sinking ship. But it's odd too. And I want to close with this: is that somebody that's done absolutely nothing, that it was motivated by King, has a state funeral, and former presidents are at his funeral, eulogizing and praising this guy. And the man that he followed, Dr. Martin Luther King, never had a state funeral. We had to fight 25 years just to get a state holiday for this man. He never laid in state. Why? Because at the end of the day, King was not the type of a leader that white people could endorse and say, follow him. But John Lewis is, because he's never done nothing. Because he's never really did anything. The only people that he ever fought for was everybody but black folks. Everybody. He was down with LGBT rights. He would advocate that, gay, trans, all of this stuff. You understand? He was into intersectional power, and intersectionality is one of the main reasons why you don't have unity in this movement. Okay? But nobody wants to challenge this intersectionality. We know that oppression and exploitation and capitalism affects different classes and different segments of society differently. But that's not to say it's not oppressive. That's not to say it's not exploitive. But what do? Do we elevate this individual or sectional oppression above the oppression of the masses of people that is aimed at? We don't do that. The real comradeship comes on the front line, okay? Most of the white folks that were supported the BLA when we were underground, some of them were gay and lesbian.
Wait a minute, just to be clear, your argument against intersectionality is that it's what? It's academic, it's aesthetic, it's symbolic, it's not
I'm saying
materializing in actual organized struggle. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying the intersectionality is a reflection of how oppression oppresses a multiplicity of people at the same time. But the internal is the basis of change, and the external is the conditions of change. The white supremacist social and political construct is what oppresses black people, whether they're gay, straight, or whatever. Because when them cops are gunning your ass down in the street, they ain't gonna ask you what's your gender preference or what bathroom you use. They don't give a, they don't care. They don't care. That's not to say that patriarchy hasn't played a part in oppression. Of course it has. I mean, anybody would be foolish to say it hasn't, because most wars are led by men. Most wars have been fought by men. And patriarchy comes from male fear of the womb. That's basically what it comes from. They want that someone who stole all this money wants to make sure that his kids get that money. And the only way I can make sure is to make sure this seed belongs to me. So I'm gonna press this woman to make sure that she delivers my seed so I can put this stone. I mean, we know what it is. Nobody's sitting here saying that we shouldn't fight patriarchy. But where was patriarchy fought in Mozambique when they was fighting the Portuguese? In the bush. That's where all that patriarchy went out the window. Can you clean this AK system? Yeah, I can clean it better than you. Oh yeah, go ahead. Oh man, how did you do that? All that patriarchy went out the window. You understand? So it's in struggle that we achieve our equality. It's on the front line that we achieve our equality.
I know we were supposed to be wrapping up, but Dhoruba, so much of what we hear about your generation and your even your organizations was that even in those moments on the front line, women were being oppressed. There was all this.
Of course.
So.
But they were being champion. But they were being a champion too. Mm-hmm. Like you take somebody like Janice Cyril. Okay, Janice Cyril was a hard-working, smart sister, but she wasn't aggressive. She wasn't, she wasn't an Afeni Shakur. Okay, but Janet is the one that got stuff done. You see what I'm saying? And of course, she was the victim of idiots that were in the party. I ain't gonna mention no names, but most of them came from the West Coast. I know. But that's what happened. I mean, it is what it is. Because when the Panther 21 were arrested in New York, there was no leadership. And the West Coast sent out leaders. And the two leaders that they sent out turned out to be two knuckleheads. I mean, that's who they were, And you know how knuckleheads are. They follow orders. And that's exactly what they did. I mean, you got to give them their props. They followed orders. They wasn't just doing this on their own, but they were absolute sexists. Now, some of us were more sexist than the others. I mean, we know, just like racism, man. I mean, even when I was dealing even with Bill Kunstler, Bill Kunstler recognized his privilege as a white person. He recognized he had to fight against white supremacy and racism, even within himself and his personal view. He recognized that. So I could even tease him about that. And he would tell me, Dhoruba, I took my shahada. Imam Jamil gave me my shahada. So it's like, okay, bro, you got to cut me a brick here. You understand what I'm saying? I'm on the right path. Okay, so all I'm simply saying is,
that's funny.
We know that these things existed. But when somebody would say that 80% of the work in the Black Panther Party was done by sisters, that's not true. It's on the front lines that sexism is challenged. It's in the struggle against the enemy that our patriarch institutions are abolished and taken down. It's not just by sitting down accusing each other of oppression and getting in a personal relationship. It was Audre Lorde that said it's the personal is political and the political is personal. Well, if that's the case, then our personal struggle against the enemy is political. And our personal adaptation to that struggle, our development as revolutionaries, the things that we admire in Malcolm and Martin, we admire the fact that when they confronted the truth, they changed. They did not just say, oh, this is true, I ain't got nothing to do with that, I'll keep it jiggy. No, when Malcolm discovered something or came up on something that contradicted things that he may have believed, Malcolm was forthright enough as a revolutionary to say, I was mistaken here. This is more like this here. Well, we need to do that in the struggle right now. And I just want to end by saying, if you can, folks should just get and read Gwendolyn Brooks' second sermon on the Warpland. And she tells you that it's in the wild weed, it's in the struggle that we are really citizens. You know, it's in this struggle that we are really human beings, not by declaring ourselves human beings, by making other people recognize our humanity with our own empowerment. The things that white folks fear the most are Black people that recognize their humanity and that's willing to defend it at all costs, with guns, with or without. That scares white folks, because we were never supposed to realize that we were human beings. That's what all this slavery was about. We were 3/5 of a human being. We were not really supposed to read. We were not really supposed to write. We ain't supposed to think for ourselves. We wasn't supposed to do none of that. Okay, so when we realize our humanity and we say, we are not going to let you oppress me, that if you shoot at me, I will shoot back, that if you are wearing a blue costume and you think you're going to inflict the justice on me, I'm going to inflict revolutionary justice on you. There's going to be funerals on both sides, not just on my side. We have to have a democratic distribution of the pain, and that's real democracy in a white supremacist society, a democratic distribution of the pain. And that's what we need right now. Crackers need to feel the pain that we feel. And that's what's going to bring them to the negotiating table. That's what brought them to the negotiating table in Vietnam. That's why Kissinger and Lee Dak-to both got a Nobel Peace Prize, okay? That's why de Klerk and Mandela both got a Peace Prize, because there was an equal distribution of the pain. We ain't the only ones that are supposed to feel this. We ain't the only ones supposed to be calling for our mama with a cracker needle in our neck, okay? They need to go to funerals too. They need to mourn for their loved ones too, and understand that we have this humanity together on this planet at this point and at this time, and you're not going to take my humanity from me under no circumstances. That's why I tell these kids in the streets, you are right. You are stay in the streets. If you don't stay in the streets, they won't change nothing. And you have to understand this, that your presence in the street is not going to change in and of itself. You have to make sure that there's a consequence for everything that they do to us. There should be a consequence for George Floyd. That's how the BLA came into existence. It exerted a political consequence. You kill one of us, we will whack for you. We will hunt you down and we will whack your ass. Now, you might go to jail, you might kill us. Hey, ain't nobody get out this life alive. I didn't expect to live this long. I never expected to see any of this. Now that I see it, I'm happy, I'm glad, but I realize that these kids are about to reinvent failure because they don't have no connection to their history, and the enemy does. And the enemy knows what it's doing, and they don't. That doesn't mean that they're insincere. They just have to organize. And I think it was a white communist who said, female too, I think she was a suffragist, she said, don't mourn, organize. We just shouldn't mourn George Floyd. We need to organize, and we need to organize for power. And if we're not organizing for power, and we're just talking about how, oh, I'm oppressed because I'm a black woman, and the black man is more oppressive to me than the white man. I mean, come on, man. If white supremacy isn't personal, then misogyny isn't personal neither. And misogyny is part of a system. People ain't become misogynist. Nobody was born misogynist, hating on women. We were made that way. We were socialized into that behavior. And if we were socialized in that behavior, we could be socialized out of it. And the only way that we can be socialized out of it quickly is to overthrow the system that supports it, that maintains it, and that grows fat off of that misogyny. And that's capitalism. And that's the system right now that we represent. It's not something that's separate and apart from this. It's all part of the same thing. And if you recall, the Black Panther Party was the first organization on the left, a black nationalist, if you want to call it that, even though we were Pan-African, that endorsed gay liberation. Huey P. Newton wrote a position paper on what happened in the village when gays rebelled. This is the macho Black Panther Party. And we're supposed to be macho, right? We're supposed to be running around with guns as a substitute for our genitals, right? We're supposed to be on some macho oppressing black women stuff, right? But we write the only, Karanga ain't write nothing. He gave you Kwanzaa. You understand? He ain't write nothing. You know? All of these professors, Dyson, Bryson, all these guys, they were students then. They didn't even have a Black Studies program. We were the ones fighting for that. Now they're the ones pontificating on what we did, and we still alive, and nobody even asked us what we did. Ain't nobody asked us. And that goes to your point, what you were saying about T.I. and nobody asked us. Of course, after we die, after I die, other folks are gonna say, "Man, did you see what Dhoruba said 25 years ago?" But I'm dead by then. I mean, there's a whole history on the BLA. I read on Wikipedia. It doesn't mention my name or people I know once. That's because I'm still alive.
Well, people can go to I Mix What I Like and get that discussion we had about the history of the BLA.
Well, that's gonna be there. That's gonna be there after I'm going anyway. Yeah. You know.
Well, look, man. Again, thank you very much for doing this, having this conversation. We'll definitely look to have many more with you. And as always, because it's clear as day with you. To you, we say peace because you're willing to fight for it, like Fred Hampton used to say. So peace to you, Dhoruba, and everybody watching. And thanks for tuning in.
Thanks again, brother. Peace.
Peace. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.